Rio Cortez is a New York Times bestselling author of The ABCs of Black History. I have learned to define a field as a space between mountains and golden axe. Her poetry collection, Golden Axe, was long listed for the National Book Award for Poetry and the PEN America Open Book Award. The poems in Golden Axe point back to Rio's childhood in Utah and reflect the outward and earthly landscapes of the Afro-frontier and the inner cosmic imagination of the Afro-pioneer, as well as family histories, real and imagined. Rio was born and raised in Salt Lake City, Utah, and now lives in New York City. Please welcome Rio Cortez.
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction, Ruth. And thank you guys so much for having me. It's my first time on campus, I was saying, and it's really beautiful. And I'm grateful to be here with you. So I was saying that I think 35 minutes of poetry is a lot. I don't know how you guys feel. So I'm going to try to be chatty in between and maybe give some context if you have read the book for some of the poems, if that sounds good. And I might actually start with my author's note, and then get into some of the work. This is the author's note from Golden Axe. Can you guys hear me okay? Is this like a good, okay, I'm trying not to do this. Much like the way Afrofuturism seeks to envision a future for Black people at the intersection of imagination and science fiction, a future that also seeks to remember the Black past, in many ways, Golden Axe hopes to find its place and definition as a work of Afro-pioneerism or Afro-frontierism, terms that describe or inform my family ancestry and experience. This work is autobiographical, but it's also a work of imagined history. These terms approach my experience of girlhood in Utah, wondering how we came to be here, feeling singular in a place where I knew we had been for generations. Continuing to ask myself, how does a story begin? The question became an obsession. This is a question so many ask, whose histories are cut short by the design of transatlantic slavery. I no longer wonder to myself whether aliens possibly put me on Earth, smack dab in the Wasatch Mountains, or other systems of sci-fi that I transposed onto myself as a child. Eventually, the question became an urge to mine the hidden history of the Black West and to tell the story of how we came to settle that frontier, both physically and spiritually. The poems in Golden Axe reflect the outward and earthly landscapes of the Afro-frontier and the inner cosmic imagination of the Afro-pioneer. There's more here, but I think I'll move forward. I continue to talk a little bit about how my family came here after Reconstruction. They were enslaved in Louisiana, and they came here probably part of the California Gold Rush, and they stayed in Utah. My second great-grandfather, Paul C. Howell, was the first Black police detective in the state of Utah, and then my great-grandfather, Abner Howell, was an LDS. He was part of the LDS faith and wrote a lot about his testimony, which gave us sort of a very unique insight into our family history that I think a lot of Black Americans don't have as a result of that, and so I write a little bit about that too here. But I'll get into some poems. So there are a lot of sonnets in the book. Some of that, they're not perfect sonnets, there are a lot of broken sonnets. This is one of them. This is Covered Wagon as Spaceship. Standing unseen in the little blue stem, curious and not quite used to living, I consider whether it's aliens that brought Black folks to the canyon's valley. Standing in the great evaporation of a lake, holy dandelion for eyes, full and white and searching the landscape for understanding. How do you come to be where there are no others except science fiction? I am a child feeling extraterrestrial, whose history untold is not enough. Anyway, it begins with abduction. This is a poem called UFO, for instance. I'll read the poem and then I'll talk a little bit about it. When the hole between blue spruce widens and twists into a cosmos, when the wild lilac and campfire atomize, and night hangs their smokes across its belly, when in the clearing you are certain you are not lonelier, but there is a lifting in you, where other knowing rises too and divides you from the bone in your feet to the fat round your heart and leaves you surrounded by your own breath you emerge from and watch vanish and think the night ate your knowing, and how could anyone know anymore? You might as well look out into the clouds of long pine that hang brambled and orange in branches. You listen for howling, but none comes. This is a poem that came to be in an unusual way. My grandparents were evangelicals, but they were very strong Christian believers, and they went to a part of Utah, and they saw something in the sky, and when they were camping, that they couldn't describe, and I think that their faith wouldn't allow. And so when I was a kid, I knew that story, and it would sort of change over time. And so I wrote that poem thinking about knowledge that you sort of have in your body that you can or can't discuss. And so that's sort of the origins. It's hazy. But since you guys know this area, I wish I could remember what it was called, because you would probably be familiar. It'll come to me and I'll think about it. It's that place where there's a lot of strange happenings. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? It's like, there's like a whole Netflix series about it. Anyway, it'll come to me later. Yeah, where is that? But what's the county? It's like, maybe, yeah, Uinta County is definitely where, and then there's like a town. I'll share it with you. If I had brought visuals, it would be of this area. I'll read a poem called "I Have Learned to Define a Field as a Space Between Mountains." If I remember a field where I stroked the velvety hound's tongue and cracked its purple mouth from stem, and it is not a memory, then what were the limits of the field? Sometimes we are driving south toward Zion in a crowded truck filled with my mother, and we pass the same red wildflowers until someone says, "Indian paintbrush, Rio. Haven't you seen them before?" And have I? Other times I pose in front of a giant flor de maga, its soft petal saucers larger than my head. My father fixes one behind my ear and says something in a yeri, but for what photograph? I am a conjoined hibiscus-headed twin, except I'm local. I braid the long hair of the willow, and like a young warrior, I swing across the canal bed by the braid. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the willow trees, we hung our harps. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? I read this once in Sunday school, tripping on it. In any field, I'm certain I can be seen by someone. How couldn't I? When I'm blood divided 100 ways, when I pray to the God called, "Do not board the ship," when I'm protected by so many masters of the vine. They must be in here somewhere. They must see me this far into the desert. It can't be that I'm alone here. I search behind the cattails. I scramble the wood. Has it gotten darker? A child, and all I can see are houses. Every house is a rambler filled with a plastic snake full of sand, or a well that isn't really a well. Every house is on a street named after the Ute tribes. I'm in Ute country, in a field to fly a cheap kite, but it gets caught in pine sap. I walk home, but not without pocketfuls. I think I'll scoot to I Learned to Shoot a Bow. This is another sonnet. I grew up, my grandfather was a bow hunter, and he tried to give us that knowledge, but this is I Learned to Shoot a Bow. It is no river Jordan that flows here between the railroad tracks and the back porch. It's a canal, not unlike my mother, low as it want to be and fullest when it rains. existing for however long without a name, and singing under a timber bridge that we built. We built that. Isn't that our story, to be denied the beginning? I cross the bridge to shoot a sapling bow my grandfather has carved. He helps me aim into cardboard flats stacked against the willow. I guess this is where I am Orion, with two birth stories. In one story, I come from a sea god with the forest as my mother, and in the other, I have no mother at all. I'll read one more sonnet called As Cain. It has a little beginning part. It says, until 1978, Mormons maintained that in a spiritual preexistence, blacks were neutral bystanders when other spirits chose sides during a fight between God and Lucifer. For that failure of courage, they were condemned to become the accursed descendants of Cain. I think of the earth that drank Abel's blood as I uproot foxtail from the garden. Earth, not passive, but cursed by God, having accepted death and maybe even hoped to grow from it. And Cain said to Abel, let us go to the field. I cut my own thumb on a weed. I carry out a strict ritual of healing, cold hose water, and then most holy mouth. Tell me, what mark has God given me? I'm paraphrasing here when I say God told Cain to rule over his own longing, or else restless wanderer shall he be on earth. First curse, then blessing. God's always changing his mind about us. Then I'll switch from Salt Lake a little bit. I think these are poems. They're in the first section of the book, and they really they have a lot to do with just my upbringing, some of the language and vocabulary that I think I grew up with, which is spiritual in nature. But I started experimenting as sort of a break from what I think I call more, I think Sylvia Plath used the term like blood poems, things that feel like they risk, things that feel like they kind of go back into your psyche, that are hard emotional work to write certain poems. And I started writing more playful poems that subverted film and television by inserting Black women where there were none. I think I did that in a way because it's humorous, but in another way, I think because these were television shows or media that I was consuming that I was really attracted to and drawn to, and I just never had the opportunity to really see myself in leisure or in repose, and always in struggle. And so it was just a very enjoyable writing process. So one of the poems that came out of that is Black Frasier Crane. And if anyone's watched Frasier Crane, it's my favorite show. So this is Black Frasier Crane. As lonely in her overthinking and as forgiven, Black Frasier Crane is a woman in a multi-generational household with more than enough square feet. Black Frasier has a small staff, but she treats them like family. She has a soothing radio voice and reserved parking at both her condo and the office. Black Frasier complains about little everythings, because what is more important than the fine dusting of cinnamon on the perfect ratio of foam to espresso, except the knowing that you and only you have the sense to complain? And who else could understand but a sister? Two black cranes in custom Italian suits joking about Freud. Isn't this the hardest work, to be happy when you already have everything? To have so much, you give some up, not away, but to the beast in you that just takes and takes until there are no more brulees and no more canapes, just the mind's endless narration. In that vein, I'll also read, for those of you who maybe don't watch Frasier, Black lead in a Nancy Meyers film. So Nancy Meyers is She's directed It's Complicated, has anyone seen that? Or they're like movies with a lot of middle-aged white protagonists who fall in love in a beautiful house, like a beautiful architectural design. It's like usually on a seaside. It's very wonderful. So this is Black lead in a Nancy Meyers film. Aging at all, I want that. And to fall, perhaps most honestly in love, beside the ocean, in a home I've paid for by doing as I like, drinking good wine, dusting sugar over a croissant, or the stage play I'm writing myself into, aging Black woman in neutral summer turtleneck, known and jogging, lonesome enough, eating homemade lavender ice cream, the moon blooming through the kitchen window, the distant sound of waves. Learning French as a second language. Votre pâté Mario, I smile back, and then, just like that, falling cautiously for my busy middle-aged lover who needs me but has never truly seen me until now. Our Black friends celebrating with hors d'oeuvres, our Black children growing older. So I'll read a few. It's like I have some that are based in New York too, but I think that I'll stay on this thread a little bit. And I'll read The Idea of Ancestry. This is after a poem by Etheridge Knight. Etheridge Knight was a poet who wrote during the Black arts movement. He was in a relationship with a poet called Sonia Sanchez, if you're familiar, probably one of the most famous of the Black arts poets. And he wrote this poem, The Idea of Ancestry, from prison. So the whole premise of the poem is that on his wall, as he's incarcerated, are photos of his family members, and he's thinking about them. And I wrote this poem thinking about that idea of, but in the mountains. And so it was really the juxtaposition of all that space and all that confinement, I think, was what inspired this work. The Idea of Ancestry. I am in a sweet place, standing in Mill Creek on a road in its canyon. And this sweet place has also been the sweet place of my people. I'm staring into the water my grandmother fished with a rod and a line. I'm standing near the head of a timber trail felled by my grandfather's grandfather. I am listening to the aspen, its green coins singing in the wind. And I know it sang just like this for them. I'm standing right at the center of its singing. The same sound heard by black bears or the calf of a moose, lying even sweeter in the yarrow, showing we can be moonless and shining in wildflower. I know this timber was once a house, my mother's grandmother's mother's hammer in hand, everything throttling backward toward me through time, a timber roof that has kept the frost from coming in and stinging my babies. We made that for ourselves. I consider choosing. There are times when it is a joy to remember. I like to think about my people drinking fresh buttermilk from the chosen farms of their other people. All of us gazing back at the house, framed by our future knowing, filling up on fresh tomatoes, and after, maybe lying like the silk calf in the deerwood and the aster and never ending. All right, I'll read two more little sonnets, and then I'll close with maybe a New York poem. This is called Pre-Earth and Post-Earth Life. I think I'll premise this by saying I think there's a lot of really great conversation about ancestors, especially like in marginalized communities, like thinking about the struggle and the adversity that your ancestors faced and how they're protecting us and looking down on us. But I also wanted to subvert that and think a little bit about our ancestors' imperfections. What if they aren't protected? What if my ancestor didn't love me in the way? So this is sort of an unpopular thought process, but it led me to this poem. Pre-Earth and post-Earth life. Pre-Earth was covered in snow. I told fibs. I wanted my co-eternal God to love me more than they loved everyone else. My ancestors are imperfect. They don't always look upon me in wonder. They were here too, engaging in little vanities. Who then do I turn to when I want applause? When God knows the truth already? What is it they say God is subject to? Continuous revelation. It feels like a loophole, but it takes a lot to admit when you're wrong. I'll read one more shorty, Family Tree at Earth's Surface. And I think in the process of this book and thinking about looking backward, especially when you come from a lineage of people whose histories are so truncated, I think for a lot of Black Americans, knowing your grandparents' names is a victory. And I spent a lot of time at the Family Research Library next to lovely neighbors and people who are tracing their lineages back to 16th century France and monarchs of England. And I think that's one of the biggest, that is the brutality of enslavement, is that cut off there. But what it left for me and what it leaves, I think, for generations of people is all of this space to imagine, and all of this room to be really creative. And I think there are all these different kinds of knowing, and there's never an answer that I encounter in this book. You know, as far as I've looked in the process of genealogical research, I could never get to my fourth great grandmother. And nobody has their own name, and this is all by design. And so rather than, filling those empty pages, which I think is impossible, and that the task of which could drive you mad, I think you encounter other kinds of intuitive knowing. And I think that's where the poems in this book has really been a wellspring. It's like accessing intuitive knowledge and using that as a surrogate for history. And so I think this is a little bit about that process. So this is Family Tree at Earth's Surface. After looking and not looking without using all the tools on the table, expert, archive, attic, past word, hunch, self, I come to nameless mother and her son. In one matter of seeing, they lived not long ago, but for me, unnamed mother is just as well the moon, tide maker. Blackness does not begin there, but first breaks into a boy they call Jackson, lever of his last name, farmer, coffin builder. Of course, we know there is another tool, another knowing that we arc forever, an arc in which the moon herself is affectionately mothered. And so comforted, I lose the impulse to keep counting, recording their names at all. So I think from here, I might just I'll read a joyful poem, 2 joyful poems, and then I'll close with a poem called Visiting Whitney Plantation. Read an ancestor maybe, because I was talking to Spencer about it earlier. And this is from a time in my first apartment in New York. Sleep drags from me. I'm living on the top floor at 176th Street in Audubon. Rain falls through the hallway roof, no matter how many times we ask to patch it, turns the marble steps slick as king snakes. The apartment is dark. Behind me, the AC whirs and pigeons roost upon it, snagging their claws in its slats, cooing in unison. There's a man I don't know at the foot of my bed, dressed to go dancing. My body cool as a gun. His benevolence washes over me, and we look, us both, at the other for some time outside time. I show him one version of my Arawak face, and there are no matters. We are neither. The night pigeons settle on the vent and make sounds I'm certain of. So I think what's fun about that poem for me, or that experience, it's sort of this liminal space that we're talking about, like the liminality of my grandparents camping and seeing something from the unknown. But in that liminality, I think there's still historic information to imbue. So from that experience, thinking about ancestry and writing about ancestry far away from my ancestral home, I think was a delightful experience. That's why I think of it as joyful. And then I'll read a poem called What Begets What Begets. Everything is a ring. I'm working on a belief that starts like that. Everything is a ring. It has the illusion of progress. I woke up blue, so all day long I tried to make the world blue around me. I heard in a movie once that hurt people hurt people. Now I always say that when I'm comforting unhappy friends. I curve the ring so not even I can see it. How it winds right back to itself, loops right around me when I think it must be going. I say to myself, look at this sad fool. I'm always explaining myself to my lover. I say to him, there are two kinds of knowing. Some knowing is as close as my own palm. I don't even know I know it. I love my mother, and my mother loves me. Other knowing gets submerged. Beauty always strikes me when I consider it leaving and am hurt by it. How now light enters through the curtains at dusk, and I find it beautiful because it is about to change. One layer of that knowing is of the self. Isn't it like that for everyone? Sometimes the ring comes round and I feel I don't deserve a thing. Then I do the work of knowing. I see myself reflected in the bathroom mirror. It's been a long day and I'm alone, my hair pulled into a tight chignon. And I know better by looking at me next to nothing, compared to nothing. And I say thanks to someone out there. And then I'll end with this poem. And I just want to thank you guys again for your time and your kindness and generosity. This is called Visiting Whitney Plantation. I got a grant from the Jerome Foundation a few years back to go to Louisiana, where I thought my family had been enslaved. And I only knew this because of a text that they were selling at the Utah Daughters of the Pioneer Museum by the Capitol. And they were selling a text called The Negro Pioneer, written by Kate B. Carter. And it was like a staple-bound pamphlet. I bought 20 of them because in them there's like a lot of testimony from Black LDS members early on in the 50s and 60s. And one of the testimonies was of my great-grandfather, Abner. And only through them publishing this in his letters did I discover that the church sent him back to Louisiana in sort of like a missionizing effort, which I thought a lot about. Like, I thought what it would have meant for your father to have been born enslaved, for you to leave that place as the first generation of free people and to return there with this message about God for you. And so I thought a lot about that in the writing of all these poems, but I also wanted to make that journey. And so my second great aunt had self-published a book called Utah and the Early Black Settlers, and in it I found the name of this town. And so the grant was to go to Mansfield, Louisiana, and see what would come. And I thought I would go and I would write a books-length collection of poems on the experience of being on Louisiana soil, and it would just like sort of come to me. And I wrote this one poem, but I went with my mom, and it was a really transformative experience. But I think I say that to say that sometimes you think the things you think will be generative are not always generative in a productive way, but they are in more intangible ways. But this is Visiting Whitney Plantation. Clouds hanging so low, they almost touch the wooden colonnettes of the big house. The brick held together by animal fur and mud, fuselage, the hands that formed it. I raise my arm and rub the belly of a cloud. Our tour guide is Black and doesn't remark on architectural flourishes. I'm grateful and still wiping sweat from my brow. We are in Wallace, Louisiana, looking for our people's names now upon a marble wall of 70,000 first names in no particular order. I sidestep a white man with a camera so that I can take my mother's hand from her mouth and hold it. On the way to New Orleans, we stop to gather Spanish moss. A groundsman opens the gate after hours. He looks softly after my mother and me. Could it be that he's one of us? I fill my purse with moss and unlock the rental car. How cruel the sun must have been to the slave, I think, when I get back to our French Quarter hotel and lie poolside in a two-piece, desperate almost. Thank you guys very much. We'll end there. Do I stand up here? Can I sit down? Should I sit? Yeah. Oh, okay. Awesome, yeah. Perfect. Here for questions. There's always this like agony of, will somebody ask you a question? Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I like sonnets because I have a tendency to write really short poems. I feel like if I could, I'd write 5-line poems. And that works sometimes. That's the right amount of lines for certain poems. But I think it pushes me a little bit to write the 14. And so that's why I like sonnets, because I'm getting a little past my comfort zone, and for me that just feels perfect. And there's something about sonnet that's pretty forgiving. There are so many examples of poets writing in the sonnet form where they're slightly breaking rules, of the syllable count, and they're incredible poems. So I think there's something about it that's like really generous, unlike a form like a villanelle or a pantoum, where it feels like the very strict rules of adherence are important to make that poem work. I think the sonnet is like a gentle form, and I personally think it's the perfect length for poems that I like. Yeah, that answers your question. Yeah. Yeah, I was saying to a class earlier that part of my revision process is reading aloud, and I feel like it's like breath instruction, I think, a lot of times. If for a sonnet, it's not, because you're thinking about it differently. But for a lot of poems, and I have some poems where there's like indentation in between lines, I think you can do breath instruction with punctuation, but you could also do it with space. And it sort of depends on the content of your poem. If you're thinking about vastness, if you're talking about the Great Salt Lake, like I think rather than use a comma, I would rather like create space or nothingness, like depending. So I think it's both it's most formally breath instruction, but I think there's another way to use space that can sometimes contribute to the overall meaning or gesture toward meaning in your poems. Yeah. Yeah. I think so. I think for that, there was like I don't know if you guys experience this as writers, but sometimes you'll just be writing in one way for a long time. And when I wrote that, I was writing just really short lines, like columns, kinds of, and that felt like the breath instruction for me. So I would get out like 4 or 5 words and move to a thought, and so that's sort of how it worked. And taking out the punctuation just made it important for those breaks to be shorter, the line breaks to be shorter there. Yeah, I'm not a great punctuation user, so I think for me the better tool is space, generally speaking, too. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think that your reading is probably right. That was a critique. I think I was writing that poem. You can come to poems with a lot of different feelings, but I felt rage. That was like the feeling that I felt when I wrote that poem. And I was reading a lot about the principle of continuous revelation, and specifically what that means for marginalized people, what it means to be able to have official divine knowledge that changes, you know? And so I think your initial reading is probably closest to how I meant it. But then I think there was a secondary layer there where I got to think about my ancestors as not perfect. And I think that's something that really has given me a lot of freedom, actually. Thinking about my ancestors as imperfect, like I'm writing prose now, I'm writing a memoir, and it's given me a lot more freedom to think about their whole truths, rather than the stories that we're told about people or the stories that you want to be told about you, but like really finding the truth in that and not judging it, but having that be the best story that there could possibly be is the true one, not the reified version that you put on a pedestal. But yeah, and so that principle has just been a really helpful principle for me in general as I think about my family and I think about myself even. So yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, right behind you. Sorry, will you repeat it? Oh, so many. I wish I could, maybe I'll write an email. Could I write like an email with like 15 collections or something? But yes, I was just talking about Robin Cost-Lewis's book. She won the National Book Award for, which is Voyage of the Sable Venus, and then her new book, which if you're interested in the intersection of family history, American history, genealogy, and poetry, is like a really good book to check out. What is it called? It's a To the Realization of Perfect Helplessness. Yeah. But I could send a list. Okay, cool. That would be fun for me. I feel like I don't have the budget. I'm always like, oh, so many new collections I have. But libraries are excellent, so. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you ever come across a reading of your poetry that surprises you? Pleasantly, hopefully?
Yes. I think the experience of putting out a debut collection of poetry has meant that people review it. And so that's been really interesting. And some readings you are like, oh, I didn't intend for that to come across at all. And then others, which are really gratifying, are when somebody finds sort of like exactly what you're getting at and exactly in words that you don't have. I'm not a critical reader myself. People who write critically are like so fascinating and impressive to me. And so being able to read and like in someone's craft, their own craft is criticism, and being able to read about your work and their craft of criticism has been like really, that's a very wonderful feeling. But on the other hand, sometimes surprising in that it either misses the mark of where I intended it to go, or I could see exactly how you come across a reading like that, but just not having been my intention whatsoever. Yeah, so that has been happening. You have to be open. Goodreads, really hard place to go. I try not to go. I try not to go there as a writer, but like other reviews I'll read. I started like when it first came out. My husband knows, he's here. I would like go to Goodreads all the time, and I would be like, and then I highly, if you're publishing, I don't recommend you do that. People don't always write reviews on Goodreads with a generosity of spirit that you would hope for. But I feel that way for all writers. I'm like, what a labor for you to have written this book and then for someone to come and like in a minute just like eviscerate it with like, I didn't get it, and then just like read it once and then you're like, anyway, but yes, I think I'm honored constantly that anybody takes the time to read the book and that anybody would have output or thoughts about it. It's like a complete honor and continues to blow my mind. Yeah.
I really like the title of the poem of the space between islands, the field, the space between islands, and it almost, and several of your titles of the poems felt like small poems within themselves. I guess, how do you go about finding a good title? Because you seem like
Oh, thank you. I never title first. I don't know how you guys feel about that, poets, but I always write the poem first. And then I feel like the title is an opportunity. It's an opportunity, and I try not to do it too literally, but to create like to help your reader. So sometimes, especially when you're writing short poems, like the title could just be one tool to sort of direct how the poem's being read. And I feel like it's like the most precious opportunity. And so I try to do that. And sometimes I feel in a rut about it. I felt at one point I was like, wow, my titles, I feel so strongly about them. And then others, I feel like especially in the last few years, I've been like, I'm not getting there. There are also, like there are poets you read and the title is just more of a refrain, like in a song where like the refrain is like, and I love you, and then the title is, and I love, and I feel like that's also valid and valuable. And there are poems that come across like that, and you're like, oh, I just want to remember this refrain. But if you choose to do so, it's also a really excellent opportunity to guide your reader, I think. Any other questions? Yeah, back there. Yeah. Do you have recommendations? I feel like you could do it. That's the beauty and the horror of that exercise is like invisible black women. That exercise of not finding yourself it really has a lot of potential. I've done it in the book. You'll find that there's Annie Hall by Woody Allen is in there too. I tried to find things that were like almost violently erasing black people from them. Like I suppose I could do it with Friends, but also things that I love, because I think that's the contradiction is like, on the one hand, this is such a valid critique of what I'm watching, but on the other hand, I'm watching this and I really enjoy it. And so I think it would have to be something that I feel that way about, like something that I find comforting and really appealing, but at the same time, I'm not in, there's like no trace of me. Yeah, but thanks for that. Oh, that's me. Shit. Sorry. I have like a phantom alarm at 12:45 for no reason, and I just haven't ever turned it off. It's been like a year. And I just live my life like that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, all right. Well, thank you guys so much. It's been really a pleasure hanging out with you, and your questions have been amazing, so I appreciate your time.